Um, we're gonna finish up this little section, and we'll do this again. We may do it at the end of the time as well. There's so much of this kind of stuff. The first week we talked about what happened between the Old Testament and New Testament, where there was a Hasmonean dynasty where Israel was the size of the nation during the time of David and Solomon in the intertestamental period. And the Romans ended that. Boom. Then last week we had the lovely story of the wonderful, loving family called Herod, right? And we talked about that. And I'll bring all those notes next week, okay? If you miss it, or if you wanted to email to me, I can send them out in an email, and I can give you all the notes if you want that as well. Just email me. It's monty@salembc.com. So anyway, I'd be glad to email it to you. Otherwise, I'll bring them next week. And then last week, we didn't quite finish. So I didn't have the notes from last week. So if you weren't here last week, you just have to watch me or look at your neighbor. So at the end of the Herod dynasty began falling apart with his sons and grandsons. We talked, there's 4 Herods in the New Testament, right? But they're not the same person, right? And so as they began dying and falling off, then Rome started putting in procurators, which is another kind of word for governor, right? Procurator. And what's one of the famous procurators we know? Pontius Pilate was a procurator. The New Testament mentions 3 procurators in the New Testament, okay? The first one's Pilate. Pilate was placed in there as governor, and we'll talk this later, probably because he hated Jews. Very, very much hatred. So when he shows up, he has the legions marching in with him with the Roman stations or their banners with the images of the Caesars, which were considered what? Idolatry. He marches in with them as he comes to his new job, just ticks every Jewish leader off day one. No other procurators or governors did that before Pilate. Deliberate offense. He did not move them, and then after, finally Rome said, take it down a notch. So he took it down a notch. He tried to placate them by, there was a famine, he brought water, he tried to, finance his project, though, from the temple. So he said, there's a famine, so he provided water, then he took money from the temple to pay for the water project. They didn't like that, did they? Not. So Pilate was really not going well. He thought he was kind when they rebelled against it. He told the soldiers, don't use your swords, just use your batons. Thinking it's restraint, right? So he thought he was doing a good thing. It didn't. And so actually, remember when Luke 13 mentions that a bunch of Galileans were massacred, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices? Remember he mentions that? That's probably this, referring to this incident where he came in and he killed a whole bunch of them during this time. So that's probably what they're talking about. Pilate mixed the blood of the Galileans during this time. Obviously, he was there at the trial of Jesus. We know that. Pilate sent to Rome by the governor of Syria. They basically put Pilate on trial for this. So he had to go to Syria. He had to answer for the killing of all these Galileans. They basically said, tradition, Eusebius, which is one of our early church fathers, Christian fathers, said that Pilate killed himself. He committed suicide instead of going through the trial. So we don't really know. But most likely he was found guilty, and its Roman policy was you're better off just killing yourself. So that was pretty standard. This next layer of procurators were Felix, Antonius Felix. Felix is also in the New Testament, isn't he? When Paul gets arrested, I remember after his 3rd missionary journey, he gets arrested in Jerusalem, and he's taken to Caesarea Philippi, and he's put in prison. Felix is the one there who puts him in prison. Felix was a prisoner, a freedman. He married Drusilla, Herod Agrippa's daughter. So he was married into the Herod family. Okay? He married Herod Agrippa's daughter. He suppressed robbers and murderers. Probably is the one who took care of the Egyptian referred to in Acts 21:38, the Egyptian that was murdered, got murdered. That was probably him and Luke. But most of the time, he was pretty bad dude. He used what they called the Sicarii. You ever heard of the term? Sicarii are assassins. Felix was very, very fond of using the Sicarii to get rid of anybody who disagreed with him anywhere. So they were a covert group of assassins that he would send out into the population, into everywhere, to take care of anybody who disagreed. And so he used them actually quite a bit. Anyway, at one point he even killed a high priest with one of the Sicarii. Paul appears for him in Acts 23. Okay? Drusilla is upset. Remember his wife talks about that she tells him, this guy Paul is upsetting me. Remember? Mentioned that in Acts 24. And then he imprisons Paul for, remember how many years? 2 years. Probably because he's wanting a bribe. He doesn't realize Christians are not wealthy. Right? So he stays there for 2 years. He gets recalled, and his replacement is a guy named Festus. And this is also in Acts 25. Festus seemed to be a good guy. So he looks and he's trying to clean up all of Felix's mess, and he finds this guy in prison, Paul, 2 years, and says, why is this guy in prison? Seems like a religious matter to me. Why is he in prison? So he calls the Jews and asks the Jews to say, why is this guy in prison? He's a Jew. And basically the Jews come in and say, oh yeah, you need to bring him back to Jerusalem and we'll handle this ourselves. Okay? All the next, just bring him back to Jerusalem. It's a religious issue. We'll deal with it in our courts. You don't need to bother with it. And Festus says, okay, this sounds good to me, right? Herod Agrippa, this would be which one? The fourth Herod. He and his sister Bernice, remember we learned about them? Living in an incestuous relationship together. That's who Paul sits before in Acts 25. Remember? Festus has Agrippa and Bernice come and talk to Paul, and Paul, remember, tells them, you guys are kind of, you're close, you kind of get it. But then they don't get it, do they? No, they don't. All that's going on, and then so basically Festus says, this does sound like an issue. I was going to send you back to Jerusalem and let them handle it, and what does Paul do? He appeals to Rome. He says, I want to stand before Caesar myself. And when any Roman said that, you immediately, whatever case was going on, you went to Rome. Okay, like the Supreme Court. So you could skip everything. It often didn't go well because it depended on the mood of the emperor on that day, or bribes, or anything. It wasn't a great thing to do, right? But Paul wants to get to Rome, and he knows he goes to Jerusalem, they're going to kill him. Well, that was Festus. And then it's about 4 years after this, there's a revolt against Rome. The Jews revolt. They take Masada, and they capture it, and they take all the armament that's stored up there, and they attack Jerusalem, and man, it doesn't go well. And we'll talk this a bit later, but Titus comes in, who eventually becomes emperor, and in 70 AD, 4 years, and he absolutely wipes out Jerusalem. The temple had been built, completed for 7 years before it was absolutely destroyed. So in 70 AD, the Jews revolt, Romans come in and say, we're not playing. And they destroy Jerusalem and they destroy the temple. At that point, Judaism changes from a religion about the temple and sacrifices to a religion about the synagogue and the Torah. Right now, the Torah is what's worshipped, right? There's no hasn't been sacrifices since AD 70. Hasn't been a temple since AD 70. So now it switched to synagogue and Torah. Is when it began to make that change. Anyway, that happens. Masada holds out for 3 more years. Because if you've seen, I think Judy said if you've been there, remember, I think you guys have seen it as well. It's up on a mound at the top of the city. They retreat to Masada. They hold out for 3 years. And then the Romans come in, and it takes them quite a long time, months, to build a siege ramp all the way up to get to it. So they have to bring in debris and work. And the historians tell us the Romans were ticked. We had to work hard, so they were looking forward. When we breach these walls, we're slaughtering every single man, woman, child in this place. They finally get to siege ramp. They breach the walls of Masada. Every single person's dead. The zealots killed themselves. Well, they didn't kill themselves. They killed each other. Suicide was against their laws. So they all killed each other, except for a small little family that was hiding in a cupboard. And that's how the story got out of actually what happened. At that point, Rome becomes a colony of Rome. Jerusalem does. And Sanhedrin is disbanded. All sacrifices cease. But they still are an entity. They're a province, a Roman province. And then in 132 to 135 AD, there's another revolt by a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, which means basically Starman. So he proclaimed himself to be the Messiah. And he's going to restore Jerusalem and Israel back to its greatness of the Hasmoneans. And Rome comes in and they decimate everything. And at that point, Jerusalem and Judea cease to exist, period. As a matter of fact, it becomes a capital crime for a Jew to enter Jerusalem except one day a year. If a Jew entered Jerusalem, they were executed. One day a year. When Titus destroyed the temple in 70 AD, he did it on the same day that the Babylonians destroyed the temple. Coincidence, huh? So, the Romans said Jews were allowed to come back to Jerusalem one day a year to celebrate the destruction of the temple. You came back any other day of the year and you were executed. So then all Jews had to disperse, right? And so the Jewish nation ceased to exist completely in AD 135 until 1948. So anyway, that's last week's. We should have got that. So hang on now because I got to go fast. Or I hope you ate because we just may not, well, I'm not skipping lunch. It may be a late lunch. We're not skipping meals. That's just wrong, isn't it? We got my family and they were like, hey, let's go to brunch. I will add a meal, but I'm not taking them. I'm not combining 2 to 1. I can do breakfast, brunch, and lunch, but I'm not going to skip 2 and make 1. I thought I'd get a couple amens on that one, at least. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's good to add them, but we don't want to be taking them away. Roman history, and how did it fit into the first century and into the New Testament? And I thought we'd hit that real quick. Now, if you know your Roman history, the Senate ruled for wonder, right? The Roman Senate was amazing, but the Senate lost its power. And so in 60 to 40 BC, we have a guy named Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar is the intellect, and it's called a triumvirate. There's 3 of them. He was the brains, Pompey was the force, and Crassus was the money. And they ruled all 3 of them together. Crassus looted temples and was killed doing that. We know Pompey, right? He was the guy who invaded, we talked about him last time. He's the one who invaded Jerusalem, right? And made Rome a power over them. Julius Caesar decided that he wanted to be the only ruler. There's no more 3, right? So in the famous battle, he crossed the Rubicon, declared war on Rome, and said, that's it. The Senate said, Pompey, go get him. Right? So Julius Caesar and Pompey, they start this battle that takes place, and then Caesar wins the battle. Pompey goes to Egypt. He killed there. And we talked about all the intrigue with Herod and how they helped in that. I won't go into all that again. And so Julius Caesar becomes the only Caesar the only ruler of Rome for the first time. The Senate's losing power, right? I am the Caesar. Julius Caesar. I'm it. I'm the ruler. So the Senate said, what? Do you remember the story? No one needs that much power. So they had up a couple of guys. Remember their names? Cassius and Brutus. Et tu, Brute, right? And on the Ides of March, right, in BC 44, what did they do? They assassinated Julius Caesar. And that takes place. He was the one who was in charge when Rome took over Palestine. And then the next three guys came in. Mark Antony, which was Julius Caesar's chief lieutenant. Lepidus, who was his proconsul or governor. And then Octavian, Julius's nephew. So now we have a new group of three, right? We have Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. And they ruled together for a while. And then Octavian says, we've got to get revenge on Brutus and Cassius. So he goes after them, he catches them, he kills them. And that's all going well. And then that's when Herod gets to power. Lepidus is killed, and now it's Antony and Octavian. And they don't like to rule together. I'm not going to go over it. We understand that Antony and Cleopatra, all their hatred and intrigue, right, with Herod and all we talked about. So Antony said, I want the East. Give me the East Empire, which was Palestine. So he took over the East. He appointed Antipater's sons, which would have been Herod the Great, remember we talked about that, as governors. Octavian took the West at Rome. But eventually, Octavian said, I want it all. So he and Mark Antony fight. Remember that battle? The Battle of Actium, right? 31 BC? The Battle of Actium that took place. Okay, Antony and Cleopatra, they fled. What happened was, they fled early in the battle. So the morale of the soldiers went where? And they lost. And then Antony and Cleopatra escaped, and obviously they were caught in Egypt and they killed themselves. And then Cleopatra ended that whole Ptolemy dynasty. She was the last empress of that Greek Ptolemy dynasty. And we talked a lot about them already and how I won't go into all that. Octavian then is now the only emperor again, like Julius Caesar, and he changes his name. He changes his name to Caesar Augustus. Okay? He is the great Caesar. He rules from 27 BC to AD 14. This is the one who had the census taken, right? And made Mary and Joseph go back to their hometowns. Because being a good Caesar, he wanted more what? Money. So they're going to tax him. He was great influence on early Christianity because, when the Bible says that at just the right time Jesus was born, and we'll talk this a little later, for the first time in human history, you could travel pretty safely. Pretty much anywhere. Because of the Roman road building, right? And those Roman roads are still there. It was so sobering to be in Turkey back in 2019 and in Istanbul and walking on Roman roads. I mean, these were roads that were built by the Romans and we're still there walking on them, So you could travel in safety because Romans had garrisons every so many miles. You could travel in fairly safety. And then because of, remember we talked about Alexander the Great's influence, the Hellenization, everybody spoke what? Greek. Koine Greek, ancient Greek. Everybody spoke it because of the influence of that Greek culture. So now we have a road system. We've never had that in human history. Pretty safe. And we have a common language. Whatever your home language was, if you wanted to do business, you spoke Greek. What an amazing time in history, right? For Jesus to come and the gospel to take off. Anyway, Octavian dies a natural death, and then Tiberius comes in. He was the reign during Jesus' ministry and crucifixion. Tiberius, his prefect or his captain of his personal guard, is who put Pontius Pilate in the place because they both hated the daylights out of the Jews. So they thought if we put Pilate in there, he'll do nothing but aggravate them. And that's what we want. He died a natural death. And then came a lovely guy named Gaius Caligula. Have you ever heard of Caligula? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Almost, well, he was considered probably insane, but he kind of took the pressure off the Christians because he hated the Jews so much. He ordered a statue of himself to be built and placed in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? And that was around the 40s, around AD 40. So, right, this is the time right after Jesus. So the early church. So the statue of him was built. It was shipped to Jerusalem. The governor of Syria was like, this is going to cause a revolt. So he delayed the delivery until Caligula died. Actually, he didn't die. His own personal guards killed him. And most historians says he just almost insane. He was so self-consumed. He and Herod Agrippa I were very, very close, probably in a lot of ways. They may even had a sexual relationship. They were probably very, very close. And he's the one who gave him the title king in Acts 12. That would be Gaius Caligula. Then Claudius came to power, and he gave Herod Agrippa I more power. And he's the one who banished all Jews out of Rome. He said there's this horrible thing going on. It's all this ruckus in Rome with the Jews. Why do you think there was ruckus in Rome with Jews? Probably because of Christianity. Because Jews were normally pretty calm, right? They stayed under the radar if they could. Well, in Rome, they're calling on us good. So basically, Claudius came in and banned all Jews from Rome, which is when Aquila and Priscilla met Paul because they had to leave Rome. Remember in Acts? That Aquila and Priscilla had to leave Rome. And when they left, they took the gospel with them. So they were Christians in Rome who had to leave because Gaius Caligula kicked out every single Jew out of Rome. And then became our lovely Nero. Right? Nero became emperor at 17 years old. By the way, Claudius was poisoned by his own staff. Okay? Let me remind you, pick your friends well. Right? Nero came to power, and his mother was kind of bossy, so he executed her. Immediately. She was controlling. He said, you can't control me. Well, he's 17, so she's still trying to exert control over the 17-year-old king. He has her killed. We'll read this in a minute, but the Roman historians, not Christian historians, the Roman like Tacitus and Suetonius, who wrote a lot, they say Nero drew this elaborate plan. He considered himself a great architect. Okay? He drew this elaborate plan of a brand new Rome. Okay? The Roman Senate said, no, we're not financing that. We're not doing it. There's no way. It's not going to happen. So then mysteriously, Rome burned to the ground. And the historians say Nero did it. Nero set the fires, burned Rome to the ground, and then guess what they did to rebuild it? They took his plan and they rebuilt Rome based on Nero's plan. Okay? But Nero started getting a lot of flack that you burnt Rome down. So Nero came up with a plan. And he said, I didn't burn Rome down. This new group called Christians burned Rome. So he started a campaign to persecute the Christians because of their burning, they burned Rome. Okay? This was the first official persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. It wasn't globally. It was only in the city. It was only in Rome. Matter of fact, tradition says this is where Peter and Paul were both killed. And we know, timeline, Paul was in Rome in his last time, and Nero would be the one who beheaded him. And then Peter was crucified upside down, tradition says. That would have been all during Nero. Basically, his own personal guard revolted against him. He escaped into a room and killed himself. But let me read what one of the Roman historians wrote. Tacitus wrote this about Nero. Again, these are not Christians. But all human efforts and all lavish gifts of the emperor and appropriation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the fire was a result of an order from him. Consequently, to get rid of this report, Nero placed guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class that were hated for their abominations called Christians by the people. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, had suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous and superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out not only in Judea, but the first source of evil, but even here in Rome, when all things hideous and shameful for every part of the world find their way here. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty of being Christians. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, but because of their hatred against mankind, because they wouldn't participate in the idolatry. So, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. They were covered with the skins of animals. They were torn a piece by dogs. They perished. They were nailed to crosses. They were doomed to the flames and burnt. They served as nightly illuminations to the parties when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens to the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer and stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of kind of compassion, for it was not, it seemed, for the public good, but for the guilt of one man's cruelty that they were all being destroyed. Now that's a first century historian talking about Christianity. And then Suetonius, another writer, wrote this. Punishment was inflicted by Nero on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. He put an end to the diversions of the chariot drivers, who formerly were immune, and then goes on and on and on. So anyway, that was Nero. And he did. He would have these elaborate parties, and he would crucify Christians all throughout the area and then set them on fire as candles to light the parties. Why? Because he's deflecting the blame. And the hatred for humanity would be they did not participate in the gladiatorial stuff. They did not participate in they did not worship the emperor or anybody else. Well, then after Nero killed himself, a civil war broke out. And four guys were fighting each other. The first guy was Galba. His soldiers lynched him. Vitellius was lynched by his soldiers. Otho got captured by his soldiers but killed himself before they lynched him. And Vespasian was fighting a war in Jerusalem. Okay? He was down there putting down that first revolt. He had surrounded Jerusalem. He had them all sieged. And then he realized, I got to get back to Rome. And the three guys had been killed. I can be emperor. So he left his son Titus in charge, and he became the new emperor. And he stopped all the persecution of Christians. He just didn't care. Because now Nero dead, there was no one to blame, right? So there was no more persecution of Christians during the reign of Vespasian. He died a natural death. Then his son comes to power. No persecution during his time either. But this is when Jerusalem was absolutely just destroyed. The temple was destroyed. Then came Domitian. During that break of not being persecuted, the church continued to grow enormously. Okay? Enormously. Domitian revived the national religion and said basically, if we're going to be a unified country, we need to have a unified religion. So therefore, everyone has to worship the national Roman religion. You worship the dead Caesars. You worship even though the pantheon of gods was kind of gone, Christianity said what? Not going to happen. The Jews were exempt. They exempted the Jews. His own cousin was condemned for atheism, which was the common accusation against Christians, because they believed in how many gods? One. So you were considered an atheist if you didn't believe in all the gods. So Christians were called atheists because they believed in one God. So his own cousin was actually condemned because of that. He took a definite step against Christianity because he demanded that every single Roman citizen in the empire, except the Jews, had to worship the image of the emperor. Okay? You had to worship him. And you did this by making a sacrifice, and you said, Caesar is Lord. That was your confession. That was your loyalty. Christians said, we're not saying it. Jesus is Lord. We're not saying Caesar is Lord. How do you think that went over? Not so well. They're like, there's only one Lord, and it's not Caesar. Now, were they good citizens? Christians were amazing Roman citizens. They paid their taxes. They worked hard. They benefited the economy. They were moral. They were godly people. They didn't cause revolt. They didn't cause problems. But they would not say Caesar is Lord. At all. Many Christians were martyred during this time. And this is when John wrote the book of Revelation during Domitian. Okay? John wrote the book of Revelation. And a lot of Revelation points to what Domitian was doing. Okay? And it was a book about, well, we know, right? There's one thing in the book of Revelation, right? We win. Right? That's the whole point, isn't it, right? We win. Imagine how comforting that would have been when the Roman Empire is coming down on you, and you have this book that says, it's going to work out. We win. Ultimately, in the end, we win. And then Nerva came to power. By the way, Domitian was killed by his own royal court. His own advisors finally got enough, and they killed him. Again, be careful who your close friends are. I'm just telling you. Look around. Look right and left right now. I'm just saying. Nerva came to power. Same thing. Did not bother the Christians. Did not care. Did not care. So they had about 3 years of peace. Trajan came to power. First 13 years, no issues with Christians. No problem. But then, the governor, this is really interesting. This is a really powerful letter. The governor of Bithynia, one of the northern regions, he writes a letter to the Caesar, to Trajan, and says, I have an issue in my region, and I don't know how to handle it. All my temples, which that was, by the way, temples were where the money was, right? How did temples make money? How do you think? What? They took it? Tourism. I mean, really, you traveled to these different temples. The local businesses made idols. They had, anyway, it was like a local business, right? Remember how Paul gets in trouble because Demetrius, the silversmith, in Acts says, all the people aren't buying my gods anymore. Really? Remember that? they're not buying my gods because I stopped going to the temple. And they kicked Paul out because he was causing the economy problem. Because, well, Pliny the Younger is his name. He writes, his governor writes and says, my temples are being emptied. And it's kind of hurting the economy here. And it's because of this new group of people called Christians. Not new. He said, they're growing so fast that they're emptying my temples out. What do I do with them? How do I handle them? And so, let me read it. I'll read you a portion of the letter. Is that okay? I'll read you a portion of the letter that he wrote. Now, this is Pliny writing to the emperor. It is my practice, Lord, to refer all matters to you concerning which I am in doubt about. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or for my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is that the practice is to punish or to investigate, and to what extent should I carry out punishment. And I have not been a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or do the very young and the very mature, do I make a difference when I punish them? Do I pardon them if they repent? Or if you've been a Christian and it does him no good to have ceased being one, the name itself, like if you call yourself a Christian but you don't do anything to act like a Christian, do I leave them alone? How do I deal with this group? Meanwhile, in the case of those who denounce to me as Christians, here's what I've done in the past, how I've dealt with Christians. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second time and a third time. I threatened them with punishments. Those who persisted, I executed them. For I had no doubt that, whether the nature of their creed, stubbornness, or just being inflexible, obstinate, deserved to be punished. There were others that possessed the same folly, but because they're Roman citizens, I just signed an order and had them transferred to Rome. Now, soon accusations started spreading, as usually happens, because of proceedings, and several incidents have occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Boy, that's nothing new, isn't it? Those who denied they were or had been Christians, when they evoked the gods in words dedicated by me, offered a prayer with incense and wine to your image, O Emperor, which I had ordered be brought for the purpose together with the statues of our gods, and moreover cursed Christ. If they cursed Christ, then none of those they weren't really Christians anyway, and so we just let them go. Others named by the informer declared they were Christians, but then they denied it when they stood in front of me. They asserted that they had been, but they're not anymore, some years and years earlier, some 25 years earlier. They worshipped you, and they cursed Christ, so I let them go. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault of error had been that they were accustomed to meeting on a fixed day, that they sang hymns to Christ as a God, to bind themselves by an oath. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. Anyway, he said, I judged all the more necessary to find out about the truth, so I tortured 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I observed nothing else but some depraved in their excessive superstition about this Christ guy. So I postponed the investigation and I'm asking for your advice. For the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, both sexes will be killed. And for the contagion of this superstition is spreading, not only to the cities, but to the villages and the farms. But it seems possible to keep it in check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, which have almost been deserted, have been frequented a lot, that the established religious rites are now being neglected. We want them resumed so the sacrifices can keep coming, for which now few purchasers are even found. They're not even buying our sacrifices. Anyway, So you can imagine a lot of people want this dealt with. Okay, that's his letter to the emperor. Does it make sense? Okay, and here's the emperor's reply. Again, like I said, this is around early 1st century. You observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who denounced you as Christians. It's not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They're not to be sought out, but if they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished without reservation. And whoever denies he is a Christian and really proves it by worshiping our gods, basically pardon them. But anonymously posted accusations really should have no place in prosecution. This is both dangerous kind of precedent, and really this doesn't keep with the spirit of our age. So in other words, like, you're doing a good job. If they truly are Christians, execute them. If not, let them go. Make sense? Yeah. Hadrian comes to power, and this is the last of the emperors we're going to talk about, even though it kind of goes on and on and on and on and on. The persecution gets even more severe. It gets more and more severe under other ones. Hadrian put down the second Jewish revolt. He banned all Christians from Jerusalem, like I told you, except to celebrate the Babylonian destruction of the temple. Hadrian built a great wall. You remember that? Hadrian's Wall. It goes up to where? Where does it end? Scotland. Yeah, Hadrian Wall goes from Rome to Scotland, basically all across England. The Roman Empire was at its peak size during Hadrian's reign. And after him, it starts declining. And the future emperors start blaming the decline on who do you think? Christians. Because we're not worshiping the gods. And that's why we're declining. Instead of their immorality. Roman citizens had 3 classes. By the way, if you want to keep looking at Roman emperors, there's so much going on. So that's how the Roman emperors kind of fit. Any questions? I can stop and ask a couple questions if you like. Roman citizens were in 3 classes during this time. And all 3 classes we see in the Bible. The senatorial class, which is the upper class, the wealthy class. Then you had the equestrian class, which were right below them. You wouldn't call them middle class. It'd be like upper and lower upper. And then the plebes, which would be what? The poorest of the poor. Matter of fact, they're poorer than slaves. Okay? And who do you think the most population is? The plebes, right? The plebeian class. The senator class, man, they had what they called the latus clavius, which means they had the privilege of wearing a tunic with a broad purple border. So everywhere you went, the senatorial class, all of them wore this tunic with a big purple border over them. So you knew who they were. The equestrian class had a thin purple border that they could wear up on them. You had to have so much money, you had to have so much land, you had to have, okay, for these 2 classes. It was all broken down. If you had this much money, this much land, then you could be the equestrian class. You had this much money, this much land, you could be the senatorial class. The difference was between a big proper and a small purple border, and it was all about status. Roman civilization was completely built on slavery. Most slaves were captured prisoners of war. Slavery in the Roman Empire wasn't based on ethnicity at all. It was based entirely, so you capture a nation, you bring that population back, they become your slaves, right? But they hadn't captured a lot of nations in a long time, so the slaves were just propagating themselves, right? And then the poor people would often sell themselves into slavery to be able to eat. That was pretty common as well. Now, they basically had this idea. The slave owner would say, you owe me your life because you could have been killed, but you weren't killed, and you have the privilege of being my slave. That was the idea. The children provided slaves. Again, convicted criminals were slaves. Parents often sold their children into slavery to make money. When things got bad, it's pretty common to sell your kids into slavery. Children were just dropped off. And then obviously the very, very poor often sold themselves as slaves, even if they were Roman, not citizens. But now, historians estimate that 1/4, probably up to 1/3 of the Roman Empire was slaves. Matter of fact, funny story. The Senate, because you remember, what do they have on? The broad purple, right? They thought it would make them stand out more if they voted and had all the slaves wear a same color tunic. Let's say green, for example. Say, have every slave wear, that way when we're out in public, we know that person deserves no respect, right? So they discussed this for a while, and then they finally realized we don't want to do that because then they will realize how many of them there are. And if they want, they could take over the Roman Empire. So keep them, don't dress them the same, because if they figure out how many slaves truly are, they could take over the empire. So that fell. That did not pass at all. They were doing every single job in the Roman Empire except two: politics, military. Most doctors were slaves. A lot of philosophers were slaves. Okay, you got money, right? You don't want to waste your time getting educated. You just get a slave to be educated for you. Like, I don't want to learn how to do finances. I'll get a slave. He can do my finances. I don't want to learn how to do this. I don't want to train my children. The teacher will be a slave. Educate the slave can do it. So a lot of the educated people were actually slaves. Because of that. They did every single job except politics and military. They were kept in line with fear. When the main tax was this: if a slave revolted against his master, Roman law said every slave he owned was executed. Every one. As a matter of fact, a Roman prefect, one of his 400 slaves revolted. They executed all 400 slaves because one revolted. What do you think they did? It made tattletailing a big deal, didn't it? If anybody even whispered about revolting, you told on them quickly. Because you knew if they revolted, if they tried to kill or do something, you were going to lose your life. But yeah, I think that was the most at one time. A captured runaway slave, flogging, branding. The worst places to work were, what do you think? The worst places for a slave to be put. What do you think the lowest slave jobs were? Galleys of ships. You worked to death, right? The mines were the worst. And even farming. Farming, then galleys, and then the mines. So you were sent there if you were a captured slave. But commonly you were crucified or thrown into the arena. And they would starve the dogs, they would starve lions, they would starve all these animals, and they would come out. And the entertainment was going to and watching slaves and criminals being torn apart by animals. That was the entertainment. That's what you went and watched. Or they had big iron collars that we found. They snapped big iron collars that had the name and address of the owner on the collar. That would be good. So, you see why it was such a big deal in the book of Philemon? When Paul writes the letter to Philemon and says, hey, your runaway slave Onesimus has come to me in Rome. I'm sending him back to you. Treat him like a brother. That went against every single thing in Roman law, didn't it? And that's the power of that little book of Philemon, isn't it? I'm sending him back, but he's a brother now. And by the way, if he defrauded you, which means he did defraud you, he probably stole money and ran away, Paul says what? Do you remember? Yeah, I'll pay for it, exactly. That letter is just dramatically.
What class was Paul? Do we know?
Paul's a Roman citizen. I don't know. He wouldn't have been in the question class. He'd have been in that plebeian class, but he had a trade. So, he was a trade, but he would not have been, especially with his mother being Jewish. Literary works actually went well. You've heard of Virgil and Horace, right? You've read Virgil. That was during this time. They built, oh my goodness, right? Bridges and aqueducts. And, the arch was a Roman art, right? The architectural big deal. And they did it well. Theaters, monuments, baths, and hot and cold running water. And, it was just amazing. Dramas were there. And they were about as crude and as moral as you could imagine. And Christians didn't participate. They didn't go, they didn't watch, they didn't see. The Caesars were absolutely, amazingly immoral and perverted. Unbelievably. If you read Tacitus and Suetonius, it's called The Life of the Caesars. It's all in there. Their morality was just unbelievable. It was so bad, even the Senate, even though they tried even to regulate a little bit of their morality. It got so bad, that's why sometimes even their own guards were killing. Like, we can't trust this guy anymore. Look, we know what he does. Man, the Roman stage again. The Greek works, the Greek stage, and the Greek things were not as immoral. They weren't based on crudeness and immorality like the Roman was. The Roman, they had a different, matter of fact, mathematics and science, the Greeks, right? We know that, right? I'm waiting for names. Come on now. What are some Greek mathematicians? Come on, you know them. I know you know them. Pythagoras. Archimedes. Euclid, right? Romans could care less about science or math. Did not care. They did not expand that at all from the Greeks. The amphitheater had a great influence. The bloody gladiator and wild beast and all those things that took place, that was a gift to the population, and the population loved the Caesars because of it. The more blood, the more gore, the more pain. And you can see, it talked about two young women were convicted of Christianity, and they were thrown out there naked. And the people were like, this is uncomfortable. I said one young woman was so young that she said she was nursing a baby, that milk was dripping from her as the animals were running around her, and like, let's stop it and cover her up and then let her be killed. It was just unbelievable. But the population loved it. They loved it. And that is what Christianity was. And so eventually Christianity got so large, even the people said, I don't think we like this anymore. We don't want this anymore. Again, training of children in the home was done by a slave. And I'll tell you this because there's a Greek word. It's called a pedagogos. And I'm going to tell you this because a pedagogos was typically a slave who educated and trained the children until the child got to a certain age, right? An age of adulthood. Until they were adulthood, they were under the supervision and control of the slave called the pedagogos. I say that because Paul uses that word pedagogos throughout his writings to refer to the law, the Old Testament law. Paul says the Old Testament law was our tutor. Remember he said that when our translation, tutor or teacher. The word is pedagogos. The law was our pedagogos until we came to Christ. And then we don't need that anymore. That goes away, now we're Christ. So Paul used that pedagogos word a lot to refer to the law, saying it had its place to teach us and train us until we mature, until Christ came. So anyway, I digress. Again, all the emperors were extremely immoral. They had no regard for marriage. And even in the Roman Empire, it was pretty much serial monogamy. You didn't often have one wife. you didn't often have more than one wife. You just had one wife at a time. Was kind of what it was. Extramarital affairs were common. Most temples were fertility temples to the gods, so they had male and female prostitutes that were free at the temples in most cities. So you see why Paul spends so much time talking about sexual morality? It's common. And why he talks so much about marriage? It was very common. Children were not valued at all until they hit adulthood. And even though abortion was used, most time it was called exposure. A baby would be born, typically a girl, they didn't want a girl, they would take it outside the city and they would leave it. And they would expose it till it just died by the elements. Okay? And so what started happening is you had these groups of people who would go out, they would grab up all these babies, grow them up for prostitution. And so then it said, hey, be careful who you get as a prostitute, it might be your daughter. Became the common little crude thing that went around in Roman. But yeah, exposure was the common way to get rid of children, even though they did practice abortion and other things as well. Again, travel was amazing. You could travel. You could travel. There were 53,000 miles of roads in the Roman Empire. 53,000 miles of roads. Some of them still exist today. And they had garrisons typically stationed every 25 to 35 miles would be a Roman garrison. So if there was a group of bandits or robbers, they could go either way. So even though it wasn't like super safe, but it was safer than it's ever been in human history. Which made the taking of these letters of the New Testament, right? So Paul could say, Timothy, Titus, take this letter and take the letter. But then after they read it, what did they do with it? What did they do with it? They copied it down, and then where did they send it? To all the other churches. And all of a sudden, the gospel they started sharing these letters back and forth, and all of a sudden, by 2nd, 3rd centuries, everybody has these collections of letters, and they start realizing we all have collected the same 27 letters. Is that a coincidence? No. It's how God brought our New Testament together. We'll talk about that another time. That's a whole other story. Anyway, the hard part was trying a place to stay. If you were a Roman citizen, there were inns that you could stay in. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you're on your own. Bring your food, you're on your own. Let's see. Let me wrap it up real quick. Seafaring, we already know about seafaring, don't we? Right? Remember in Acts, when Paul's shipwrecked, what's the first thing they do in a ship? Or Jonah? What's the first thing they do when a ship gets in trouble? They throw stuff overboard. Next, they get in the boat and leave. That was how they handled difficulties. I gave you a brief description here about the Roman religious world. The pantheon, the Romans weren't very creative. They just took all the Greek gods and renamed them. That's what they did. And so Zeus becomes Jupiter, Juno becomes Hera, Neptune becomes Poseidon, and yada, 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 yada. By the time of Jesus, there weren't many people worshiping those gods anymore. That had kind of come out of play. The emperor worship was big. What happened was, when the emperor died, the Senate would then have a vote that he was a god, could be worshipped. So when Julius Caesar died, the Senate voted that now we will worship Julius Caesar as a god. So you were worshipped after you died. Okay? Until, basically Caligula came in and said, I want to kind of be worshipped now. So he made his statue. But it wasn't until Domitian. Domitian was the first Roman emperor. Remember, he persecuted Christians. And he made him say Caesar is Lord. Because he said, if I'm a god when I die, I'm a god now. So you're not going to worship me when I'm dead. You're going to worship me now. And that's when he made all the Christians say Caesar is Lord. In other words, you had to confess that Domitian was God. And that's why Christians said, we're not doing it. We're not doing it. Then the mystery religions, I won't go into all those, but basically they were secret religions that had some secret artifact that only the elite would see. And what was it? We don't know. Sometimes it was a rock or a cob of corn, or it was basically. And then the cult. Some of the most superstitious people in the ancient world were the Jews. Highly superstitious. Remember him in Acts when Jesus, the man was by the pool. Remember, he's like, no one's helping me in. The waters get stirred and I can't get in. Well, they believed when the wind blew the waters, there was an angel stirring the water with his finger, and whoever jumped in the water first got healed. And Jesus said, I think I can take care of that. Now, the philosophies. This morning I was reading in Acts, and Paul's in Athens, and he mentions, you know what two he mentions? Stoicism and Epicureanism. The Epicureans and the Stoics came to Paul and confronted him in Acts. Plato believed, you all know Plato, I'm going to tell you what Plato believed, right? Plato believed that everything in the real world was not real. In other words, this is not a real table. There's a real table someplace else. This is an image of a real table. So the physical world is a shadow, remember? A shadow of the real world. So everything physical is evil, because it's only represented by the real spiritual version. This is not really a podium. It's an evil representation. That's Platonic thought, which still influences our society. And so some of the early Christians struggled with, how could Jesus be fully God and fully man if the material world's evil? But we know it's not, right? God created the world and said what? It's good. Gnosticism was 2nd century. Can I have 1 more minute extra? I'll give you 1 more minute extra. If you watch the History Channel or the channels, you'll sometimes see a new gospel was found. You see that? A new book of the Bible was found. Or what was that movie, that dumb movie with Tom Hanks and the... Yeah, Da Vinci Code and all that kind of stuff. All that's based on these Gnostic documents. So all of a sudden you'll see the Bible, the Christians suppressed all the original birth, right, all that. Well, the reality is, we all know these books. We've known them since. There was a Gnostic library found in the 1940s in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Okay, lots and lots and lots of books. They're 2nd century. They're way after Christianity. But they claim to be a Christian sect. But yet they didn't believe Jesus was God. They didn't believe it at all. They believed that our God, they believed that there was a God here, and then he made this God who was less than him, and then this God made this God who was less, and finally we get this God over down here who's imperfect enough to make our world. That's Gnosticism. And all salvation comes through knowledge. The more knowledge you have. So they begin rewriting, we've all asked, right? I wonder what happened in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve. I wonder what happened when Jesus was a baby. I wonder what happened. Well, they wrote books and said that's what happened. As a matter of fact, they also wrote a whole series of books that made all the villains of the Bible heroes. Judas was in it with Jesus. Jesus was a hero. Jesus and Judas were in on this together. Okay? The whole Mary Magdalene and Jesus had an affair or married, that's all Gnosticism. Okay? It's 2nd century. It's all about knowledge. The more you know, the better you are. Anyway, we'll go into that later. Platoism, basically same thing. World's evil. Stoicism, very rigid. Romans loved it. There is no God. It's all about reason. Cynicism. The less you have, the less you want, the more happy you are. So don't want anything and you'll be happy. Then nothing can be taken from you. Well, that's Hinduism, isn't it? And then skepticism. You can read those. Anyway, we'll pray. God, thanks for this time we had together, and just bless the rest of this week. In Christ's name, amen. Next week, we're going to start Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to try to do the first 11 chapters.